The traumatized survivor spent years running desperately through endless rivers of blood, screaming in pure agony. After enduring that crushing weight for so long, the dark-haired warrior finally stood tall amidst the crimson tides. Stepping firmly into the depths of the bloody abyss, Simon finally found his absolute answer. His new life purpose was simple. He vowed to kill the petty bastard who dared to put a price tag on his life, because that was the only way to escape this dreadful never-ending cycle of torment, as his eyes glowed with demonic predator-like rage. On the day Simon was born, the atmosphere decided to flex hard. The wind blew like an absolute hurricane around his family cabin. It turned out to be an actual cheat code of a destiny, as a glowing green wind spirit floated right up to him and chirped a gentle hello. This was not some basic Nepo baby inheritance, because Simon's mother always called it the sacred blessing of a wind spirit. The young boy looked up with a cute grin, asking the little green bird if it could cool him down just a tiny bit. The spirit took that request way too seriously, releasing a massive gale force storm that completely wiped out the warriors training outside, sending the sword fighters and a red-haired girl tumbling across the grass. One of the fighters gaped in utter disbelief, yelling out to Simon to ask if he was really the one who just pulled off that insane stunt. The other swordsman immediately recognized the crazy flex, shouting that he only ever saw this high-tier spirit magic in the royal palace, and demanding to know if the kid even realized how stupidly OP his talent actually was. While the adorable red-haired girl smiled with pure pride, the swordsman hyped him up even more, declaring that if Simon became a royal mage, his father would definitely be pleased. Simon just stood there looking precious, low-key unaware that he was already a certified prodigy. But that cute slice-of-life vibe did not last long. A sudden horrific nightmare shattered his world, as blood splattered violently across Simon's terrified face. That beautiful blessing ended up placing an unbearable blood price on his entire life, leaving behind a tragic sea of slaughtered bodies lying face down in a dark, gory pool of death. The traumatized survivor spent years running desperately through endless rivers of blood, screaming in pure agony. After enduring that crushing weight for so long, the dark-haired warrior finally stood tall amidst the crimson tides. Stepping firmly into the depths of the bloody abyss, Simon finally found his absolute answer. His new life purpose was simple. He vowed to kill the petty bastard who dared to put a price tag on his life, because that was the only way to escape this dreadful never-ending cycle of torment, as his eyes glowed with demonic predator-like rage. Meanwhile in the present, a heavy storm raged as a wooden dam suddenly broke apart, unleashing a violent torrent of water on a helpless village. People screamed in sheer terror, with one desperate man shouting for someone to help him as the water threatened to swallow them whole. To fight the flood, a cloaked mage stepped up to use magic, which was defined as the slow, tedious process of borrowing divine power through mana and incantations. The mage began chanting complex purple runes from his magical circle, while a panicked villager begged the mage to hurry up before they all got completely swept away by the current. The wizard ignored the pressure, slowly channeling his purple magic circle and chanting the spells. With a dramatic shout, the mage managed to create a massive purple barrier, barely holding back the raging waves. Those who could wield this complex power were known as mages, but they clearly lacked the efficiency of a true powerhouse. As soon as the barrier held, the selfish wizard casually deactivated his spell, declaring that his job ended right there. The terrified client panicked, begging him to hold on because there were still so many innocent people trapped in the flood. The cloaked fraud turned around and angrily trash-talked them, snapping that the original request was completely different in the first place, reminding the man that they only asked him to reinforce the dam with magic. The desperate villager tried to explain that they had no choice because the dam collapsed while the wizard was still on his way, but the greedy bastard just held up a smug OK sign with his fingers. He coldly told them that enough was enough, stating that his commission fee was charged per single use of magic, so if they wanted him to save more lives, they needed to pay up and cough up more cash. The poor villager stared in absolute rain-soaked despair, crying out in disbelief at how a human being could be so heartless. Nearby, the rushing water slammed into a wooden platform where a terrified little kid was left stranded, clutching a pet dog tightly to his chest. A massive wave towered over the child, ready to crush him, while only a select few elite mages possessed a different kind of power. Suddenly, a massive swirling green tornado erupted out of nowhere, tearing through the floodwaters as a stunned villager shouted to ask what in the world was happening. This was the legendary power of those who contracted with spirits, allowing them to wield the raw forces of nature using only mana, completely bypassing any tedious incantation. The greedy mage gaped in utter shock, realizing he was looking at an actual wind spirit. The magnificent green gale wrapped perfectly around the falling debris, gently shielding the little boy and his pet from the devastating crash. The young boy opened his eyes in complete shock, staring up at the miraculous green light that saved his life. From above, a colossal green dome of pure wind magic protected the entire village, making the standard wizard look like an absolute clown. This legendary art was known as spirit magic. A cool voice announced that while he was not taking any more requests, he was passing by, so he might as well take care of this mess. Walking past the stunned greedy mage, our hero revealed himself, looking incredibly cool with a cute blue glowing bird spirit perched casually on his shoulder. The astonished villager stared at the majestic blue bird, muttering in pure awe as he realized who this legendary savior might actually be. With his epic cloak billowing in the fierce wind, Simon marched straight into the raging storm, ready to show the world what a real overpowered wind mage could do. As the story moved to Ratville in the Thuris Kingdom, the local villagers were frantically searching the dark streets, asking if anyone managed to find it, only to be met with disappointment as one man admitted they had no luck and that it was nowhere to be seen, bitterly complaining about another wasted day and wondering where on earth it could have gone. That was when our guy stepped out of the shadows, wearing a dark cloak and politely asking if there was an inn available in the village, but the stressed villager apologized, explaining that they were dealing with serious trouble and could not take guests, suggesting he head to another village just further down the road. Our protagonist did not just walk away though, asking what happened and mentioning that he heard they were looking for something, offering his assistance while a weird blue bird perched on his shoulder. Before he could explain, a loud pretender stepped forward with maximum clout, dramatically announcing himself as the legendary Wind Mage, which immediately made the villagers gasp in confusion. The villager with the torch asked who he was and admitted they appreciated the offer but doubted he could help, prompting the fake Wind Mage to wipe his brow with supreme arrogance, asking where he should even begin before demanding to know if they even understood what a mage was. A local woman replied that she heard about mages as a child and thought they were dangerous, but the fraud interrupted her, claiming she could not be more wrong and explaining that a mage was someone who wielded an incomprehensible power called magic. He began flexing a glowing hand under the moonlight, passionately listing off how mages could move boulders as big as houses, divert massive rivers, and even breathe life into those on the brink of death, declaring that magic was doing what was impossible for ordinary humans. The scammer added that among mages, spirit magic was a special kind that very few could wield, explaining that by contracting with spirits, they could harness the raw powers of nature like water, fire, and wind, claiming that only those with a deep understanding of nature could master it before proudly boasting that he was a mage who commanded wind spirits. He smugly claimed there was nowhere in the world his wind spirits could not reach, asking if they now believed he could help them, which made a villager wonder why someone so amazing would bother helping a small town. The fake mage facepalmed in fake disappointment, dramatic as ever, asking if they had really never heard of him and explaining that there were a few famous mages in the world, referencing Alex Magellan the archmage who protected the country, Mahatma the saint loved by gods, Karuna the guardian of mages, and finally the legendary wind mage who righted the wrongs of those in distress. The fraud pointed to the derpy blue bird on his shoulder, to-dawing in front of them and asking if anyone had heard of the gray-haired mercenary who traveled with a blue bird, which made a naive villager gasp in realization and ask if he was truly the legend himself. The pretender posed dramatically, claiming it was embarrassing to blow his own horn but confirming it was him, making the hopeful villager ask if he would really help them. The scammer then held out his hand with a sparkling money gesture, stating that he was both a mage and a mercenary, promising that if they showed a little financial appreciation, he would make their troubles his own, which forced the desperate villagers to sigh and agree to gather their money. As the villagers panicked and rushed to collect cash, shouting that every second counted, the greedy fraud trash-talked them behind their backs, yelling at them to calm down and demanding an extra fee for an urgent request while our boy stood quietly in the dark cloak, watching the whole scam unfold. Later that night inside a house, the fake mage poured a massive bag of gold coins onto a table, sneering to himself that the villagers paid a lot because they were desperate, chuckling that it was a backwater village where no one actually knew what the real wind mage looked like. He hopped out of the window with the heavy bag of gold and the blue bird locked in a tiny cage, admitting he felt a little bad for them but claiming they only had their own naivety to blame. Suddenly, a cold voice from the darkness ordered him to stop right there, startling the scammer as the cloaked traveler asked where he was going in such a hurry and what happened to the request he was paid for. The fake mage recognized him as the traveler from earlier and arrogantly smirked, telling him to mind his own business and get lost, offering to let him off easy since he was in a good mood. Simon raised his hand calmly, stating that he could not do that and demanding that if the fraud had no intention of fulfilling the request, he needed to return the villagers' money immediately. The fake mage grew angry, drawing magic power and asking if the traveler had backup or if he took him for a joke, deciding to make things quick as he cast a purple spell circle and screamed magic knife, shooting sharp purple energy blades directly at the cloaked figure. The scammer taunted him with a crooked grin, giving him a word of advice that nobody should mess with a mage, boasting that he would be the last mage the traveler ever saw. But Simon casually deflected every single magic knife with effortless wind flicks, looking totally unbothered as he noted that seeing him use magic proved he was indeed a mage, asking why he pulled such a cheap scam in the first place. The fake wizard bugged out in sheer shock, wondering how his magic was so easily deflected, while Simon pointed out that using pheromones to attract glowing bugs was just a cheap trick to draw people's attention, admitting that as a fellow mage, he was embarrassed for him. With his eye glowing a sharp blue, Simon listened to the blue bird inside the cage pitifully cheeping for help, causing the true contractor to gather surging currents of wind around his hand, firmly stating that Elkane was not a parrot but the great wind itself. Suddenly, the magnificent gigantic form of Spirit King Elkane manifested above Simon, causing the fake mage to sweat profusely and scream in sheer terror, recognizing the true wind mage. Spirit King Elkane mocked the scammer, sarcastically noting that the fraud did a decent job mimicking Simon, even if he looked quite a bit like his pathetic self. The fake mage freaked out even more upon seeing the spirit talk, but Simon calmly offered him one last chance, telling him that if he returned the money quietly, he would forgive him for impersonating him. The trembling scammer realized why the traveler could use magic without chanting, suddenly recalling a terrifying battlefield memory where a single wind mage wiped out dozens of men with a power worth 100 soldiers, but remembering that on that day, no one actually lost their life to the wind mage. Realizing the hero was a soft-hearted guy who refused to kill out of sympathy, the fake mage hatched a snake-like plan, reaching behind his back for a hidden dagger while pretending to surrender, handing over the heavy coin bag and claiming he was cooperating. Simon took the bag and offered genuine advice, telling the capable-looking man not to deceive others in the future and to work honestly for his keep. But as soon as Simon turned his back, the fake mage pulled out the sharp blade with a psychopathic grin, lunging forward to stab him while screaming that if he got close, he won. Simon did not even flinch, casually summoning lower wind spirit Ellie onto his fingers, and declaring that he would have to make him feel like working honestly. Simon commanded Ellie to use Spiral, shooting a compressed drill of wind that violently spiraled into the attacker's arm, completely twisting and crushing the fake mage's flesh until he let out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony. The scammer collapsed to his knees in the dirt, clutching his ruined arm in tears, while Simon coldly informed him that it would take quite some time before he could ever use magic again. Lifting the sniveling fraud by his throat with glowing blue eyes of terrifying killing intent, Simon delivered a chilling threat, warning him that if he ever pulled a scam like this again and crossed his path, his neck would end up just like his broken arm. The terrified scammer shrieked in absolute horror and ran away crying into the night, leaving Elkane to comment from Simon's shoulder that the guy was running for his life, teasing Simon for being too soft and asking why he did not just kill him permanently. Simon picked up the birdcage, unlocked it to set the trapped blue bird free, and explained that helping people while working as a mercenary was his way of atoning for what he was about to do, stating he had no intention of adding to his sins by taking a worthless life. Looking up at the night sky with cold, uncompromising resolve, the true wind mage declared that he would not take another life, at least not until he finally killed the man responsible for his tragic past. Following up on his promise to fix the scam, our boy stepped right back into the village the next morning and casually tossed the heavy bag of stolen money onto the counter, informing the shocked husband and wife that the wind mage they hired yesterday was an imposter. He explained that he caught the fraud trying to slip away in the middle of the night and recovered their commission fee, warning them to be more careful in the future before turning around to leave. The husband held his chin in regret, admitting that it was no wonder the guy seemed suspicious, but explaining that they were just desperate enough to grasp at straws. Simon paused at the doorway, thinking to himself that he could not afford to delay his own mission any longer. But before he could step outside, the villager's wife came running after him. She stopped him on the path, explaining that they were not well off and that everyone would have been completely devastated if they lost that money, thanking him for looking out for them and apologizing for how they treated him yesterday. She then placed a small, neatly wrapped bundle of food into his hands, offering it for his journey and admitting it was all they had to give before wishing him good luck. Our guy stood alone in the sunlit woods holding the gift, pausing silently as he overheard the villagers inside desperately shouting that they had no time to stand around and needed to search again. Curious about what was happening, Simon walked right back into the inn with a dramatic burst of wind, raising his hand as his spirit bird hovered above him, asking if they could explain the situation to him as well. The villager sighed and explained that not long ago, a single child went missing. But this time, every single child in the village had completely vanished, adding grimly that the first child who disappeared was eventually found dead, completely stripped of their heart. Simon gasped in utter horror, asking if the heart was really missing, and the villager confirmed that it was not the work of a wild beast, but looked like it had been surgically carved out with a blade. That horrifying detail immediately triggered a traumatic flashback in Simon's mind, recalling the raging flames and violent slaughter of his own past, where a shadowy killer ordered him to do something useful for once before demanding his heart, while young Simon cried tears of blood. Returning to reality, the villager lamented that they had no idea why this was happening and that it was driving everyone mad. But Simon stared grimly at the floor, suggesting that it might have something to do with magic. When the confused man asked what made him say that, Simon explained that since they were not familiar with magic, it might sound strange. But until just a few years ago, people believed in a twisted superstition that if an ordinary person ate the heart of a young mage, they could become a mage themselves. He detailed how people searched for young mages based on that absurd rumor, but the villager pointed out that their backwater town had absolutely nothing to do with magic. Simon countered by explaining that although the flow of mana fades for most humans as they grow up, hidden magical talent is easy to test for, holding out his palm and channeling a swirling sphere of green wind magic. He asked the couple if they saw anything on his palm, but the husband could only see a clump of blue light, while his wife thought it just felt like a slight breeze, prompting Simon to ask if they really saw nothing inside the glowing light. Inside his hand, the cute lower wind spirit Ellie was fluttering her wings, but the wife just looked confused, asking what they were supposed to see. Realizing that ordinary people could not see spirits, Simon silently deduced that any child's heart with a hidden flow of mana would satisfy the killer's target. Suddenly the wife gasped as a memory hit her, recalling that something similar happened not too long ago when people from the Urnia Order came by with a strange lantern and asked them what they saw inside the light as they went from house to house. Simon instantly grabbed her shoulder in deep urgency, demanding to know if she remembered their faces. But as the woman stuttered, the cloaked hero pulled out a drawn portrait of a sharp-eyed bearded man named Klein, asking if this was the guy. As Simon walked through the forest later with Elkane on his shoulder, he recalled the rest of her story, where she explained that they never actually saw their faces because the monks were wearing creepy yellow masks over their eyes. She had added that the lantern light was yellow and felt mysterious just like what Simon showed them, leading Simon to realize it was a light spirit. He pondered why the Urnia Order, the official state religion of the Thuris Kingdom, would be testing villagers for magical talent, while Elkane questioned if the man Simon was hunting was even responsible, suggesting he was just wasting his time helping these villagers. Simon thought back to Klein, a dangerous murderer who was also known for targeting the hearts of young mages, realizing that the news of Klein appearing near this village combined with a heartless child corpse was too perfect of a coincidence to ignore. Elkane argued that if that was true, there was no reason to kidnap all the children, since these farmers did not have a single speck of magic talent. But Simon scrambled up a steep cliff, declaring that he still could not just ignore it. Standing on top of the massive cliff overlooking the entire valley, the true wind mage confidently stated that they would find something if they investigated, answering Elkane's complaint about climbing the mountain by pointing out that if so many children were kidnapped, the culprits could not have gone far and must have set up a base nearby. He realized the reason the villagers could not find the hideout was because a mage was using magic to conceal the building. But remembering the pretender's words, he reminded Elkane that there was nowhere the wind could not reach. Simon summoned a flock of cute Ellie spirits into the air, closing his eyes as a glowing blue magic circle appeared behind his head, casting the spell Windseer. His consciousness synchronized with the wind spirits as they shot through the dense forest like sonar rings, sweeping every inch of the woods until the wind slammed into an invisible barrier, causing Simon to open his blue eyes and declare that he found it. Arriving at the location, Simon stared at a massive translucent magic barrier hiding an entire building in the woods, prompting Elkane to tell him to hurry up and dispel the magic barrier. Simon turned to him with a completely blank expression, casually admitting that he did not actually know how to dispel magic barriers, which made Elkane squawk and lose his mind, screaming why they even came here in the first place. With a cold, badass smirk, the fearless fighter pointed his finger and stated that they would just have to drag the enemies out themselves, explaining that while the cultists could hide their appearance, they could not hide their existence. Simon raised his arm and summoned the majestic high-ranking wind spirit Elshuda, but Elkane looked down on it, scoffing that Elshuda would not even scratch a high-tier magic barrier. Unbothered by the criticism, the mastermind channeled super-compressed wind currents into the sky, condensing Elshuda into a giant lethal drill spear as he commanded Cyclone Lance. He hurled the colossal wind spear down from the heavens like an orbital missile, causing Elkane to scream that he was a crazy bastard as the strike slammed into the forest, detonating with nuclear force. The sheer impact carved out a massive crater, smashing giant boulders into dust and completely shattering the hidden magic barrier to reveal the secret base below. While Simon looked down at the devastating wreckage, calmly noting that at this rate, the enemies would not be able to resist coming out. Right after unleashing that nuclear-level orbital strike, our guy stood at the edge of the smoking crater while Elkane squawked on his shoulder, calling him a crazy bastard as the ground continued to collapse into the subterranean depths. Simon looked down calmly, noting that an impact of this scale was bound to draw out the hidden cultists. Thick clouds of debris exploded into the air, forcing the wind mage to step back and cough violently from the heavy dust. Elkane complained loudly, shouting that if he was going to attack the area, he could have just used the wind of Elshuda instead of blowing up the entire mountain. Simon patiently explained that about a dozen children were missing, and the building above ground looked way too small to hold them all, so he figured there had to be a massive space hidden underground. He added that to shake an entire underground complex and force them out, wind magic was simply too inefficient, and he needed a massive physical shockwave instead. Elkane scoffed sarcastically, mocking him by calling him a certified genius, but Simon told him not to be so angry since they achieved their goal anyway. Just then the dust cleared to reveal a stone tower door creaking open, prompting our hero to slip behind a nearby tree to observe. A hooded monk wearing a creepy yellow mask stepped out into the sunlight to inspect the devastation, completely unaware that an apex predator was watching his every move. As soon as the monk walked further into the open, Simon moved like a blur, darting out from the shadows and knocking the cultist out cold with a single brutal strike. He dragged the unconscious monk over to a tree, tying him up tightly with heavy ropes before stripping the dark robe and yellow mask right off him. Simon put on the stolen disguise, telling the tied-up monk that he would borrow it for a bit before marching straight into the dark stone doorway. Descending a long, spiraling stone staircase with Elkane on his shoulder, Simon adjusted the yellow mask over his eyes, noting that things were going just as he planned before asking his spirit if they should proceed. He stepped into a massive underground cavern bathed in eerie blue light, where colossal tree roots served as the pillars of the cavern. Simon observed that the space did not look man-made, wondering if it was formed from hardened tree roots and sap as he reached out to touch a pillar, noting that it felt sticky. That immediately made Elkane panic, squawking in a frenzy as he yelled at Simon not to just touch random things, warning him that those sap pillars were explosive mushrooms that would turn the whole cave into a burning hell if they caught fire. Simon asked how Elkane even knew about that, which made the ancient spirit boast arrogantly, shouting that he had lived thousands of years longer than a wet behind-the-ears greenhorn like him. Simon told the loud bird to keep it down, hearing heavy footsteps echoing through the tunnel as two hooded cultists approached. One of the monks called out, asking what was happening outside and if he checked on the noise, so Simon put on a rookie voice behind his mask, lying that a massive boulder fell in a landslide but fortunately caused little damage. The monk questioned his answer, suddenly staring straight at Elkane perched on Simon's shoulder and asking what that bird was doing there. Simon panicked internally, facepalming behind his mask as he realized he was so used to having Elkane around that he forgot it looked totally suspicious. Before Simon could explain, the monk violently swung his arm to slap the bird away, shouting in confusion about since when they had a bird like that. Simon dodged backward with flawless agility, causing the monk to stumble as the fake rookie politely claimed he was startled. The senior monk holding a wooden chest scolded the rookie, reminding him that he was told to stay on high alert, so Simon bowed his head and offered a quick apology. However, Elkane glared at the monk who tried to strike him, his spirit aura flaring up with pure murderous rage, making Simon realize the ancient bird was definitely not accepting that apology. Ignoring the tension, the senior monk told them to follow him because they had no time, revealing a message had arrived stating they needed to hurry and harvest the next batch of children's hearts. The monk opened the wooden chest, exposing a gruesome array of dissection knives, hammers, and saws, which instantly triggered the bloody memory of the killer demanding a heart in Simon's mind. The senior monk barked at him to hurry up, so Simon coldly replied that he was coming, following the cultists deep into the prison sector. Down in the dark cells, tiny flies buzzed around starving, terrified kids who were huddling together in horror, crying out for their mothers. The heavy iron cell door swung open with a loud clang as the three monks stepped inside, and the senior cultist sneered through his mask, asking his sick crew who he should start with today. The children shrieked in absolute terror, begging for their lives as the monks dragged a helpless young boy out of the cage and strapped his limbs down tightly onto a stone dissection table. The sadistic cultist chuckled that it would be over in an instant, wearing a demonic grin as tears streamed down the boy's face. The executioner reached his gloved hand back, demanding the knife from the chest Simon was carrying, But as the monk yelled at him to hurry up, Simon suddenly drew a massive steel blade and drove it straight through the cultist's hand, impaling it to the bone. Blood splattered everywhere as the senior monk screamed in blood-curdling agony, while the cloaked hero dropped his disguise and unleashed a roaring vortex of wind magic. The violent tempest slammed the cultist into the stone wall, pinning him completely as green wind blades whipped through the air. The bleeding cultist gasped for breath, screaming in terror to ask who Simon was, but our protagonist stepped forward through the storm with a blood-soaked glove and cold, glowing blue eyes, chillingly informing the killer that he asks the questions and all the cultist is allowed to do is answer. While Simon stood over the impaled cultist, another terrified monk ran frantically through the underground tunnels, gasping for breath as he desperately thought to himself about who the hell that guy was and how he found their secret base, realizing he had to warn the others immediately. Down in the prison cell, the helpless children cowered in horror as a blood-curdling scream echoed through the corridors. Back in the chamber, massive streams of green wind wrapped tightly around the captured cultist like hurricane whips, with Simon standing at the center of the storm, glaring down and demanding to know where Heiss was hiding. The cultist screamed through his yellow mask, asking how he even knew that name, but the wind mage stepped closer with a blood-soaked glove, berating him for committing such atrocious crimes in the name of the Urnia Order. Simon demanded to know why they were doing this, asking if even the royal capital was now hunting the hearts of young mages. He commanded his wind blades to slice through the cultist's robes, making the man scream in pain before Simon ordered him to speak and reveal where Klein was right now. Spitting blood with a bitter grin, the captured cultist told Simon to just kill him, but before our guy could force an answer, a loud alarm horn suddenly echoed throughout the entire cavern. The cultist laughed darkly, gloating that the alarm system was activated, and right on cue, another monk sneaked up from behind to launch a surprise attack at Simon's back. Simon dodged the strike effortlessly, blasting the attacker away in an instant. The injured cultist on the floor sneered bloodily, mocking Simon by telling him he must have forgotten there was one more of them, boasting that they had a mage on their side and that Simon would not leave this place alive. Looking completely unbothered, the cloaked warrior asked how he could possibly forget, raising his hand to unleash a colossal wave of wind magic. The strike flattened the cultist instantly, knocking him out cold in a pool of his own blood. Rather than hunting them down individually, Simon grabbed the senior cultist by his collar and began dragging his limp, bloody body down the cold stone hallway, noting to himself that hunting them down one by one was far too much trouble. The terrified children inside the cell watched through the bars as our hero dragged the bloody streak down the corridor toward the main hall. Deep inside the cavern, a cultist blew a warning horn, causing dozens of armed hooded cultists to assemble in the main hall while nervously asking what was going on. The fleeing monk from earlier ran onto the balcony, screaming in a panic to the army below that a single mage had broken in and that Ehad had been taken down. The cultist leader gasped in shock, wondering if the villagers had hired him, but his thoughts were cut short by a heavy thud as a bloody body was casually tossed over the balcony, slamming onto the stone floor right in front of them. It was the battered body of their senior mage, and as the cultists gasped in horror, Simon stepped out onto the elevated platform, covered in blood like a terrifying demon, calmly asking if everyone was here. Grinding his teeth in rage, the cultist leader realized our boy was no ordinary opponent, screaming at his army to attack him immediately. Dozens of cultists drew their blades and charged up the stairs like a feral mob, while a cultist mage in the back began rapidly chanting a purple spell circle. The charging mob yelled for Simon to die, but the true wind contractor raised his hand, sending Ellie shooting forward like a green bullet. Spiraling wind currents chopped down the front line, sending cultists flying like ragdolls as Simon commanded Spiral, dancing through the crowd and slicing apart armor with compressed wind blades. The cultist mage in the back finished his spell, shocked to realize Simon had a contract with a wind spirit, screaming for him to die as he unleashed his ultimate spell, Arcane Burst. A colossal beam of purple energy blasted out, completely engulfing Simon's position and detonating against the wall in a massive explosion. The cultist mage laughed triumphantly, boasting that one hit of his spell was enough to finish anyone off. But as the smoke cleared, he gasped in shock, realizing Simon had completely vanished. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept behind him, and the cultist mage froze as Simon instantly materialized right behind his back. Before the leader could even process when he moved, Simon thrust a wind-infused palm strike straight into his chest, making the cultist cough up blood as Simon glared down with icy blue eyes, stating that he must be the person in charge and demanding to know where Heiss was. The bleeding leader spat blood, surprised that Simon was looking for Klein rather than the children. Suddenly, the entire underground cave began to shake violently as giant boulders rained down from the ceiling. The maniacal leader grinned through his blood, informing Simon that it did not matter because everyone would be buried alive anyway, explaining that if no action was taken after the alarm went off, the cave was rigged to collapse automatically. As the stone pillars crumbled around them, Simon summoned a giant surge of wind under his feet, launching himself upward as the bloody leader scrambled toward an escape tunnel. The fleeing cultist laughed hysterically, asking if Simon was going to chase him, taunting that while he gave chase, all those children would be buried alive. Simon paused midair, his piercing blue eyes glancing back at the collapsing prison sector. Without a single second of hesitation, our hero turned his body mid-flight, using a powerful burst of wind magic to propel himself at hyperspeed back toward the prison cell. The cultist leader gaped in utter shock as Simon completely abandoned the chase, choosing to risk his own life and dive straight into the collapsing ruins to save the innocent children. Crashing rocks and crumbling earth echoed through the cavern as the underground base collapsed, but Simon did not waste a single second admiring the chaos, slamming the cultist leader backward with a relentless blast of wind magic. Green wind blades sliced through the air and ripped into the fanatic, splattering blood across the stone as he groaned in agony and clutched his broken mask. Standing over the battered trash with cold blue eyes under falling debris, the young traveler casually asked if the bastard was looking for an exit. Pinned against the rubble and bleeding out, the cultist leader screamed that it was already too late, declaring this place their grave and taunting that because of Simon, those innocent kids were going to be buried alive too. Structural beams shattered and giant boulders caved in. But as the fanatic shrieking about being buried alive began to panic, the wind mage ignited a roaring vortex of green spirit magic around his body. Pushing his mana to the absolute limit, the contracted mage unleashed a massive beam of compressed wind straight through hundreds of meters of solid rock, punching an upward tunnel all the way to the surface while wrapping the cultist leader in a protective gale barrier. Looking up with unfazed determination, Simon declared that if there was no exit, he would simply make one, promising to get his answers once they were outside. The cultist leader clutched his bloody face in utter disbelief, mentally freaking out that digging through 100 meters of solid earth should be impossible, but realizing this insane monster might actually pull it off. Panicking through his bloodshot eye, the fanatic decided in his head that he would rather die than end up like Ehad, channeling his remaining dark magic directly into his bloodied arm to pull off one last trash move. Sensing the sudden spike in mana, the survivor turned his piercing gaze toward the cultist, just as the desperate bastard lunged forward like a maniac. The cultist tackled the young mage to the ground, grabbing him tightly as a dark cursed red magic circle flared violently to life across his body. Simon instantly realized the fanatic had engraved a magic circle onto his own body beforehand, panicking in his thoughts that the guy was about to self-destruct right on top of him. Needing immediate backup, Simon mentally called out for Elvern before realizing it was too late to dodge, bracing himself to block the explosion with defensive magic as the cultist's dark spell erupted. With the self-destruct blasting right in his face, the rising star snapped into action and cast Feathered Ward at point-blank range, detonating a massive shockwave of radiant spirit feathers that shattered the earth underground while birds chirped peacefully in the sunny forest above. Feathers drifted past an ancient stone tower ruin, but a second later, a massive explosion of light and wind blasted right out of the soil, sending dirt and rock soaring into the sky. As the dust settled over the crater, a bloodied boot stepped through the lingering smoke, with Simon emerging into the sunlight while gasping heavily for air. Stumbling forward battered and covered in deep cuts, the exhausted warrior mentally admitted that he let his guard down by not expecting a body-engraved spell, knowing that if he had been a second slower, he would have been total toast. Clutching his wounded chest, the wind mage ground his teeth over losing his only lead, wondering in his mind what on earth Klein was up to and if those monks were truly part of the Urnia order. Recalling Klein's twisted smile looming over the cultists in his memory, he kept questioning why they would commit such dark crimes under the guise of the Urnia order, letting out a tired sigh as he admitted his mana was completely depleted and his brain was fried. Right on cue, a giant white wind spirit bird glided gracefully down from the clouds, safely carrying all the rescued children inside a glowing green wind sphere. Seeing the kids fast asleep without a single scratch, a gentle smile touched our hero's face as he noted to himself that since the request was resolved, he should head back for now. Returning to Ratville, the local villagers spotted him and cheered out loud in relief, with the local couple running up to ask why he was not resting more after only 2 days, and if he was really leaving without saying goodbye. Simon smiled kindly and explained he had a long way to go, prompting the husband to dig frantically into his coat while pleading with him to wait a moment. The villager pulled out a heavy pouch of coins and offered it as the commission fee, adding that the children were recovering well thanks to his heroics. The wife stepped forward holding a neatly wrapped package, adding that she packed travel rations for his journey. Raising his hand with a polite smile, the young traveler explained that requests were normally submitted through a mercenary group or board with official payment, but since he took this job purely on his own whim, he would only accept the food. Simon took the travel rations with a warm look of appreciation, leaving the couple deeply moved by his humility. As sunset painted the horizon in golden light, a covered wagon rolled down the trail carrying our boy toward his next destination. Inside the wagon, Spirit King Elkane clicked his beak in annoyance and began lecturing his contractor, scoffing that the kid had to be out of his mind for summoning Elshuda in the middle of battle. The Hawk Spirit reminded him that sending a high-tier spirit out of his sight to protect the kids was pure recklessness, pointing out that Elshuda was not a low-tier spirit like Ellie and drained a massive amount of mana. Elkane warned that if his mana had run out for even a second, both he and those kids would have been finished, adding that even as the Spirit King, Simon should not get the wrong idea. Flashing his sharp, glowing eyes, Elkane sternly warned that he could not bail him out every single time he crawled into the jaws of death because his power was not omnipotent. Simon turned to him with a smirk, casually calling his name and asking why he had been sulking in the corner, teasing if it was because of that weak-toed spirit from earlier. Elkane immediately puffed out his feathers in denial, claiming that as the Spirit King, he did not care about something like that in the slightest, leading Simon to apologize with a soft smile while explaining he had no choice back then. Elkane sighed silently, grumbling to himself that if only this guy were not his contractor, before fluttering closer to ask what happened to the killer he was tracking down. Simon admitted he could not find Klein, but revealed he did manage to loot something useful from the mess. Pulling a burnt scrap of paper from his cloak, the Wind Mage revealed the words Gredhill Branch, guessing it was part of a letter the cultists were exchanging, which prompted Elkane to repeat the name in surprise as Simon explained Gredhill was a prosperous city housing a branch of the Urnia Order. Gazing toward the Grand Cathedral, Simon reasoned that the Gredhill branch must refer to that holy site, noting that since those monks knew Klein and there was no way Klein would ever serve a god, the religion might just be a disguise, but a connection definitely existed. Gazing at his contractor, Elkane suddenly dropped his sarcastic tone and asked a heavy question, wondering what on earth that bastard Klein did to him in the past. The wagon continued down the sunset path as a dark, suffocating heavy aura instantly filled the air, catching the Spirit King completely off guard. The wooden crates inside the wagon began to tremble and squeak under intense pressure, making Elkane panic and ask what had gotten into him all of a sudden. Simon sat in total silence with his eyes hidden in shadow, his fist trembling with pure unbridled rage as a terrifying blood-red killing intent exploded around him. As the terrifying killing intent flared inside the wagon, Simon's rage unlocked dark memories from 10 years ago in the Thuris Kingdom, where heavy steel clashed violently inside a grand gladiatorial arena. A scarred warrior screamed in absolute fury, asking how his opponent could do this to him after 10 whole years together. But Captain Klein Heiss did not care about nostalgic emotional damage, coldly replying that a swordsman should speak with his sword, not his mouth. Igniting a fiery red sword aura across his blade, the heartless captain delivered an overwhelming downward slash that cleaved through his former comrade's guard, splitting the arena floor in two and leaving the man dead in a pool of blood. As the crowd cheered, the announcer declared Klein Heiss the victor of the honor duel, while royal knights stood in formation and saluted their superior. Sheathing his blade with a cold, arrogant expression, the villainous captain taunted his dead friend that the sword had already decided the verdict, right as the guards shouted for everyone to make way for the king. Clapping his ring-adorned hands with a creepy grin, the decrepit old king of Thuris shuffled into the room, asking if the duel was already over and inquiring if Klein was all right after slaughtering his own comrade. Klein knelt respectfully and coldly stated that a useless sword is meant to be broken, earning a dark chuckle from the frail monarch, who praised him as the true sword of the kingdom, while the guard captain pledged his absolute loyalty. Later inside the lavish banquet hall, the old king complained that the mages rebelling against military conscription were complete fools, messily devouring raw meat with blood dripping down his chin. Holding up a piece of heart meat on his fork, the creepy ruler asked Klein if he had ever heard the dark superstition that eating the heart of a young mage could grant magical power. Kneeling at the far end of the banquet table, Klein confirmed he had heard of it, prompting the hungry king to chew on the bloody flesh and declare his intention to become a mage himself, though he had no idea how many hearts he needed to consume. Dangling the ultimate carrot of clout and nobility, the king told Klein it was a waste for someone of his talent to remain a mere guard captain, asking if he wanted a peerage, which made Klein grin like an absolute demon as cathedral bells chimed, swearing to fulfill his majesty's twisted desires. The nightmare then shifted to young Simon practicing at a cozy log cabin in the forest, where his uncle Rousset shouted at him to lower his stance, keep his back straight, and put more weight on his pivot foot. 9-year-old Simon was hyperventilating and trembling from sheer exhaustion, holding his wooden sword while his little cousin Diana teased him, asking if her big brother was tired already. After young Simon apologized, Roussette laughed heartily and called for a short break, ignoring Diana pouting that she was just getting started. Footsteps approached as Roussette turned around to greet incoming visitors, prompting the kids to look over and see Simon's older brother Raiden walking up alongside their intimidating father, Klein. Young Simon's eyes lit up with pure joy upon seeing Raiden, but he quickly bowed his head in fear, quietly welcoming his father back while Klein glared down at him with pure unadulterated disgust. Out in the golden sunset, Klein forced young Simon into brutal, relentless wooden sword drills, repeatedly barking at him to do it again, and again without a single beat of rest. The heartless captain slammed his wooden sword into the boy with terrifying force, leaving 9-year-old Simon panting, crying, and barely able to stand in the dark. Staring down with total contempt, Klein mocked his son, claiming it was not even worth dodging and saying he doubted if the kid was even his son, before ruthlessly swinging his sword down one more time. The brutal blow sent young Simon flying backward into a stack of wooden crates, shattering them into splinters as the poor kid shrieked in pain and crawled on the dirt, coughing in total agony. Uncle Roussette slammed the cabin door open and rushed out in a fury, screaming at Klein for brutalizing a 9-year-old child. Roussette scooped up the sobbing boy into his arms, but the ruthless captain stood tall and unbothered, asking if Roussette thought children did not die on the battlefield. Klein mocked Roussette for going soft, declaring that his other 2 sons took the Royal Guard exam at Simon's age before calling his own child utterly useless. That evening inside the cozy cabin, Roussette gently patted the crying boy's head over dinner, asking if he was all right, while young Simon sniffled and affirmed he was okay. Little Diana stuffed her mouth with bread and angrily huffed that she would beat up Klein next time, making Roussette gently scold her before reassuring Simon that his father did not mean it. Sitting beside him, Raiden gave Simon a warm, supportive smile, wishing he was good with a sword like his brothers, but reminding Simon that he had something he was uniquely great at. Leaning in, Raiden asked if Simon had told their father that he could use spirit magic, but young Simon fidgeted nervously and admitted he was too terrified of their father to say anything. Raiden promised to talk to Klein himself, reassuring the hopeful boy that his father would be pleased, before a sudden nightmare memory flashed across the screen with bloody text screaming for Simon to do something useful for once. Snapping back to reality in the wagon, Simon's dark killing intent faded as his eyes widened in lingering trauma, making Elkane turn away and softly tell him to forget it, since he could guess what happened anyway. Apologizing to his spirit partner, the Wind Mage admitted that old memories came up, adding softly that if not for Elkane, he would have died as Simon. Puffing his chest out in annoyance, Elkane scoffed at the heavy mood, complaining that because of how things went down, he was not even summoned properly and was stuck in a half-baked form, hopping around while grumbling. Simon smiled warmly at his loyal companion, but the peaceful moment was interrupted as the wagon driver brought the horses to a halt, shouting that there looked to be an accident ahead. Getting up to investigate, the young traveler told Elkane he would take a quick look and stepped out into the dark forest road. Approaching a high-class, ornate carriage stuck in a ditch, Simon overheard an escort knight apologizing to a priest, explaining they called for help but it might take time. Simon called out politely, asking if they were all right and offering help with the broken carriage. The escort knight immediately unsheathed his blade in a panic, shouting to know who goes there, but the tall priest placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, telling him to calm down since the stranger only wanted to assist them. Gazing at the young mage, the handsome priest in white and blue Urnia Order robes smiled warmly, placing his hand over his chest and bestowing the blessing of Urnia upon him. Receiving the priest's blessing with cool composure, Simon summoned the lower wind spirit Ellie to effortlessly lift the heavy carriage right out of the mud ditch, dusting off his gloves while noting that fortunately the wheels were not broken. The escort knight and priest escort looked completely stunned, with the guard marveling that anyone could lift such a massive carriage so easily, while escort serenely remarked that Urnia must have sent them a strange wind today. Walking closer with his hand on his chest, the priest thanked him for avoiding a disaster, but the young traveler stayed humble, replying that he just did what he could on his way. Escort insisted that even if it felt natural to him, help was always precious, prompting the contracted mage to look at him silently as dark memories of the kidnapped children and masked cultists from Ratville flashed through his mind, wondering if meeting this priest was truly a coincidence. Asking if members of the Urnia Order often visited a remote place like Ratville, the Wind Mage watched as Escort paused with an unreadable look, before cryptically stating that Urnia was everywhere. Escort probed back, asking if something had happened in Ratville, but Simon quickly covered his tracks, lying that seeing how much the priest cared for a tiny remote village was truly admirable. Escort smiled serenely while the knight urged him that they had been delayed quite a bit, prompting the priest to step toward his carriage before pausing to ask for Simon's name. Introducing himself with his alias Lannion, the young mage watched them drive away before the scene cut to a night crossroads, where his wagon driver cheerfully announced their arrival. Simon paid the man a generous handful of clinking gold coins, but the driver warned him that getting inside Gred Hill right now might not be so easy. Asking if something had happened to make entry difficult, Simon listened as the driver pointed toward the walled city, before proceeding toward Gred Hill on foot while Elkane warned him from his shoulder that a foul stench was in the air. Agreeing with his spirit partner that something fishy was going on, the battle maniac decided to enter alone to avoid drawing unnecessary attention, reaching the city walls where wall torches flickered over wooden spike barricades and heavy guard patrols. Seeing the gates locked down tight under an active barrier, our boy realized in his thoughts that this was definitely not business as usual, recalling the driver's earlier rumor that Ernia had brought something called the ordeal upon Gred Hill. Approaching the portcullis, Simon was halted by a guard demanding an entry permit officially issued by the Ernia Order. When the young traveler asked what happens if he does not have a permit, the guard shook his head and flatly denied him entry. Suddenly, frantic shrieks echoed from inside the gate as a barefoot young man ran toward them in sheer terror, weeping at the top of his lungs that if he died, there would be no one left to take care of his mother. The guards panicked and pointed their spears at the fleeing youth, screaming for him to stay back because he was in the terminal stage of the ordeal. Noticing strange glowing blue crystals growing right out of the youth's neck and skin, Simon wondered in shock if this was petrification, right as the poor kid tripped and crashed hard onto the stone floor before the barricade. Writhing in excruciating pain, the youth screamed in agony while the terrified guards backed away, yelling for everyone to get inside and telling Simon to get away immediately. Simon kept his cool and logically asked if they shouldn't help the guy, but blue crystals rapidly spread across the youth's fingers and face as he sobbed his tragic last words for his mother before a bloody burst of energy erupted. Blood splattered right across Simon's cheek as the youth's entire body crystallized and transformed into a giant jagged blue crystal statue frozen under the night sky. Bystanders cowered and wept in sheer despair, crying that this was divine punishment, while the petrified corpse stood frozen with its crystal hand reaching toward the moon. Wiping a drop of blood from his lip, the fearless fighter analyzed the blood on his glove, realizing in his thoughts that the crystal growth did not start on the skin but erupted from the inside, questioning if this terrifying plague was what they called the ordeal. Inside the city, hysterical citizens fell to their knees and repeatedly smashed their foreheads against the stone pavement until blood dripped onto the floor, screaming for Ernia to have mercy on them. Suddenly, the guards turned their spears and pointed them directly at Simon's chest and neck, trembling in utter horror as they told him his face was marked and he had to come with them, with an ominous dark prompt confirming that our guy had just been afflicted by the ordeal. Deep inside the grand cathedral of the Ernia Order, a massive stone statue of the goddess Ernia covered her eyes with her hands, holding a floating golden emblem over her chest, while a devout priest knelt before her in prayer, begging for Ernia to let those facing the ordeal overcome their suffering and be reborn. Rows of dark-robed cultists bowed their heads in unison against the cold stone floor, chanting in solemn harmony so the afflicted could dwell within her holy order. Outside, perching like a creature of the night high on the stone ledge of the cathedral window, a hooded figure observed the crowd muttering their endless prayers down below. Narrowing his glowing eye through the darkness, the mysterious observer let out a subtle smirk before diving off the stone tower, gliding silently through the night sky toward the barricaded outer city gates. Down at the gate, two guard soldiers stood frozen in absolute horror over the shattered blue crystal statue of the exploded youth, with their spears trained directly on the traveling young mage. The terrified guard panicked, declaring that the visitor had now entered the ordeal, suspecting that the splatter of infected blood on the traveler's cheek was already taking root. Staring back with piercing blue eyes, the wind contractor wiped the dark droplet from his face, realizing that if this so-called infection was real and things took a turn for the worse, he would have no choice but to blow these guys away as subtle green wind mana began gathering in his palm. But right before the standoff exploded into chaos, a commanding shout echoed through the dark stone archway, commanding everyone to stop. A bloodied, desperate citizen crawled along the stone ground, gasping in shock as the guards instantly lowered their weapons, shouting in utter relief that the high priest had finally arrived. Lannion turned his head in surprise, watching as high priest escort glided into the moonlight wearing elegant white and royal blue robes. Seeing their holy leader step into the light, the relieved crowd and guards erupted into cheers, welcoming high priest escort with open arms. Escort raised a gentle hand, blocking the guard's spear tip with 2 fingers and assuring them that this person was completely fine, telling the guard to take a moment to rest. When the guard hesitated, arguing that the traveler might be dangerous, the saintly priest smoothly cut him off, declaring that the deity already knew of his loyalty. Holding the spear point away with absolute chill, Escort smiled warmly at our hero, remarking that their unexpected meeting back on the road was turning out to be quite meaningful. Simon lowered his wind mana, replying that he certainly didn't expect to run into the priest again so soon. Suddenly, the bleeding half-crystallized woman on the ground dragged her shattered body across the stone floor, frantically grabbing the hem of Escort's pristine robes. The priest's hooded attendants gasped in shock, but Escort remained entirely unfazed, raising a hand to signal that everything was all right. The distraught woman pointed toward the dark gate, wailing in agony and begging the high priest to bring divine judgment upon that sinner at once. Escort looked down with an eerie, serene gaze, calling her sister and gently stating that his ordeal was not yet over. Wearing an unbothered, saintly smile over the suffering woman, the priest added that only when the destined day arrives will his true ordeal actually begin. Turning back to the masked traveler with an inviting aura, Escort casually asked if they should move somewhere more comfortable for now. As the young wind mage considered the invitation, the high priest offered a warm smile, stating he wanted the chance to return the favor for the help he received back on the road. With the surrounding crowd whispering in hushed chatter, the two glided through the moonlit streets toward the towering cathedral spire piercing the night sky, where Escort politely asked what brought the traveler to Gred Hill in the first place. Entering the massive guarded cathedral archways, the young mage kept his answer short and sweet, revealing he was simply looking for someone, prompting the priest to offer his full assistance if there was any way he could help. Walking through the grand, dimly lit marble hallways, the wind contractor silently observed his surroundings, staying low-key as the priest led him toward a private reception chamber. Escort motioned toward the luxurious seating, acknowledging it was a humble place, but warmly inviting his guest to join him for a hot cup of tea, which the traveler accepted with a polite nod of thanks for his hospitality. Steam rose gently as the priest poured hot amber tea into a porcelain cup, offering a smooth apology for the rude treatment at the outer gate given the chaotic state of the city. Our guy leaned forward on the couch, cutting straight to the chase and asking if he meant the bizarre crystallization of the body, questioning if this was some kind of contagious disease since he had never seen anything like it before. Escort paused mid-sip, setting his cup down with a subtle smirk before stating that since the traveler had witnessed the horrific event firsthand, it was only right to tell him the truth. Simon locked eyes with the priest, sharpening his focus as Escort tapped his cup against the saucer, declaring firmly that the ordeal was not actually a contagious disease. Flashback images of poor souls being brutally consumed by glowing blue crystal spikes flashed across their minds. As the priest claimed, it was merely a tragic misunderstanding born from the public's overwhelming fear, lamenting that even he had been unable to correct the fake news. Looking down at his tea, the clever young mage quickly caught the plot hole, mentally noting that if it was not an infectious plague, then blocking entry to the entire city made zero sense, especially since the lockdown was clearly ordered by the church rather than City Hall. Playing along, the wind contractor asked outright why they were locking down the whole city if there was no contagion, to which the high priest smoothly deflected, claiming the citizens were currently so easily shaken that a single unfamiliar face could spark a massive riot. Simon pushed further, bringing up the poor victim who had collapsed and exploded at the gate, but Escort maintained his saintly fraud persona, claiming the order was still actively searching for answers as well. The priest went on to explain that inside the Gred Hill Order, they maintained a sacred place called the Purification Center, where victims undergoing the ordeal could endure their suffering through earnest devout prayer. Resting his hands with a warm smile as the cathedral loomed over the foggy city, Escort falsely claimed that he prayed for those victims every single day, assuring that in the end, Urnia would provide all the answers. Shortly after, the rising star departed the church and stepped out into the quiet cobblestone streets of Gred Hill, reflecting deeply on the priest's sweet-sounding words about enduring the ordeal through prayer. The horrifying memory of the youth exploding into crystal spikes merged with the priest's suspicious, saintly smile in the young mage's mind, as he muttered the words "the ordeal" under his breath. Connecting the dots like a true mastermind, the wind wizard pondered how the corrupted town of Ratville, the Gred Hill branch, and this mysterious crystal ordeal were all tied together, realizing it was way too calculated to be a mere coincidence. Out of nowhere, a loud sneeze shattered his deep train of thought as a glowing blue bird materialized and landed right on his shoulder. Simon turned his head in deadpan shock, asking the Spirit King when on earth he got here, to which Elkane nonchalantly replied that he had just arrived. Squinting at his spirit companion, the young mage dryly asked if nature spirits even sneezed, prompting Elkane to explain that he was simply mimicking him because he felt like our guy was low-key ignoring him again. Left speechlessly staring at the bird, the wind contractor sighed before the majestic hawk dropped the comedy and asked what their game plan was moving forward. Looking up at the dark cathedral silhouette, Our hero stated that he needed to stay in the city a bit longer, convinced that the high priest was low-key hiding something massive. As they slunk through the dark alleys, the genius wizard noted that since they could not flex a direct attack on the Urnia Order without starting a war, they would have to find a sneaky alternative route to uncover the truth. But before he could even finish his thought, a stealthy shadow plummeted from the rooftops above without making a single sound. In a lightning-fast ambush, a black-clad assassin dropped directly behind our wind mage, slapping a gloved hand over his mouth and pressing a cold, curved blade straight against his neck. The stealthy attacker gripped our guy tightly from behind, muffling his voice as Simon grunted against the gloved hand, while Spirit King Elkin fluttered his wings in sudden alarm. Glaring sideways with furious blue eyes, the wind contractor did not panic for a single second, instantly unleashing his broken skill wind snap to blast a violent blade of green wind from his body. The sudden force repelled the masked attacker backward, though the agile intruder managed to block the slicing wind with his armored gauntlets before flipping gracefully onto the cobblestone ground. Catching his breath with a heavy grunt, our hero watched as the attacker burst into loud, arrogant laughter, trash-talking the young mage by claiming he had terrible luck for running into him of all people. The cocky intruder flexed his battle experience, boasting that he knew someone who used the exact same wind magic, so he already knew how to counter it completely. But as the attacker took a closer look at the traveler's face, he suddenly paused in confusion, muttering that the young wizard Loki looked like a softie he used to know. Standing tall under the moonlight, the spirit contractor pulled down his face covering and hood with an unamused deadpan expression, revealing his true identity to Edward. Edward's eye widened in sheer disbelief as he pointed a trembling finger, shouting Lannion's name at the top of his lungs. Cracking up hysterically, the rogue mercenary slapped his hands together, howling that it was a small world and welcoming his long-lost ally while addressing the glowing bird as Mr. Parrot. Elkane hovered near the young wizard's head in utter annoyance, trash-talking the human and demanding to know how many times he had to explain that he was a majestic spirit, not a parrot. Simon stared at his old acquaintance with a flat look, asking if he should not apologize for jumping him before offering a friendly welcome. Edward just laughed it off even louder, grinning wildly, and claiming that a surprise ambush was simply their custom way of saying hello. Taking a seat against the alley wall side by side, the young mage asked Edward Boker, the loose cannon of the Gromont mercenary group, what on earth brought him all the way to Gred Hill. Leaning back against the stone bricks, Edward casually explained that a mercenary simply goes wherever the clout and money are, asking what other motivation he would possibly need. Flashback memories surfaced in the young wizard's mind from a year ago when he first joined the Gromont mercenary group, while hunting down his abusive father Klein. Back then, Edward had screamed in disbelief upon learning the rookie was a mage, crossing his arms and claiming he never trusted guys who only read books because Simon looked like a spoiled softie who had never struggled a day in his life. Grabbing the young mage aggressively by the collar, Edward had declared that he was personally going to turn him into a real mercenary. During a gathering quest, Edward had lounged lazily on a rock while forcing poor rookie Simon to crawl through the dirt to harvest delicate purple mana flowers, warning him not to use magic because he would ruin the petals. Later, while subduing bandits, Simon had lugged a heavy sack of stolen loot, asking if stealing the bandits' treasure was actually part of the official request. Edward had sprinted ahead with bags of gold, laughing that a mercenary always had to look out for his own personal bonuses. Even during escort missions for corrupt nobles, Edward had casually kicked an arrogant noble out of a moving carriage, shouting that he refused to escort anyone he disliked while the noble screamed his name in terror. Reconnecting all those past headaches, our young hero mentally concluded that Edward was a chaotic wild card he should never get involved with under any circumstances. Back in the present, Edward rubbed his chin, noting that High Priest Escort treated Simon with unusual respect, and asking if the young mage was low-key a devout follower of the Urnia Order, since it was the official state religion of the Thuris Kingdom. Meanwhile, Elkane hovered near the stone floor, inspecting a strange broken object left behind in the dark alley. Simon leaned toward his old comrade, asking if Edward actually knew High Priest Escort. Edward threw his arm around the wizard's shoulders, boasting that nobody stays in Gred Hill without knowing Escort, even if the High Priest had no idea who Edward was. Simon set the record straight immediately, clarifying that he had zero special connection to Escort and was not a follower of their order, having simply helped the priest out during a carriage accident on the road. Reaching into his cloak, the young mage pulled out a drawn wanted bounty poster of Heiss, asking Edward if he had ever seen a man matching that description around the church. Edward inspected the face closely before raising his hand with an exaggerated, stressed expression, declaring he had never seen the guy in his life and asking if Simon was also on a mission to locate someone. Our guy met his question with complete deadpan silence, Realizing they were both on private business, Edward slapped his knees and stood up with excitement, claiming the timing was perfect because he desperately needed a high-tier support mage like Lanyon to act as his assistant. Edward gestured wildly, revealing that the request he took low-key involved the Urnia Order, though even a mercenary group could not openly wreck the state religion that even the royal capital hesitated to touch. Grinning with peak villain energy, Edward offered Simon a special chance to join his request, only to look up and realize the young wizard had already walked completely away, ghosting him down the cobblestone street with Elkane on his shoulder. Left sitting alone in the dark alley with his hands out, Edward scratched his head in utter disbelief, muttering to himself as our hero strolled away. Walking through the foggy night streets of Gred Hill, the young wizard ignored the paranoid townspeople who were frantically pulling their children away, muttering in fear about wandering strangers spreading the crystal infection. Looking for a place to rest, the spirit contractor knocked on a tavern door, politely asking if they were open, only for the bald innkeeper inside to yell that they were closed. Stepping inside anyway to ask for a room, the traveler was instantly recognized by the innkeeper, who sweated bullets upon realizing this was the guy splattered with infected blood at the plaza earlier. Panicking out of his mind, the innkeeper grabbed a wooden pole and slammed it against the counter, screaming at our hero to get out because they had no rooms for an infected outsider. As the furious owner swung the pole to drive them away, Simon dodged back into the street while Elkane squawked in annoyance. Outside under the dusk sky, the bird spirit complained that the foul aura in the city was starting to give him a massive headache, to which the young wizard replied that the fear from the crystal plague was ruining the whole town. Retreating into a green swirl of wind mana, Elkane announced he was going to rest, leaving our hero walking alone through the streets. Realizing the citizens were utterly consumed by paranoia, the young mage figured he would have to resort to sleeping outside for the night. Suddenly, a cheerful voice called out from behind, asking if he was having trouble finding a room and offering to help. An energetic, freckled tomboy girl with short reddish hair bounded over with an absolute golden smile. Simon looked back in surprise, asking if helping him was really okay since everyone else in the city was actively avoiding him because of the plaza incident. The girl grabbed both of his hands enthusiastically, declaring that the locals were just being ignorant over unproven rumors before introducing herself as Enoch and revealing that her family ran an inn. Walking alongside her down the road, our guy used his Lanyon alias to introduce himself as Enoch ushered him toward a cozy wooden building with a swinging-in sign. Stepping through the doors, Enoch shouted happily into the lobby, calling for her mom and announcing they had an actual paying guest. Pulling the young wizard inside by the hand, Enoch introduced him to her mother, a gentle innkeeper who welcomed him with a warm, motherly smile. Looking around the modest lobby, the young mage noted that while the building was a bit old, it was exceptionally clean and quiet. Considering local prices, the spirit contractor figured standard big city room rates were around 5 gold, feeling a deep sense of gratitude toward this family for welcoming him when the rest of the city turned him away. Observing Enoch's innocent smile, our hero realized that with the plague lockdown in effect, this inn probably suffered from a massive lack of customers, deciding he should pay a little extra gold to show his appreciation. But right as he prepared his generous tip, Enoch instantly dropped the sweet act, striking a full scammer pose with a blinding greedy smile as she demanded an insane lodging fee of 100 gold a day, cheerfully adding that every room cost the exact same extortionate price. Our young hero stared at the tomboy girl in complete disbelief as Enoch posed with her freckled grin, casually reiterating that the lodging fee was an extortionate 100 gold coins for the night. Before the young wizard could even process the blatant scam, Enoch's mother screamed from behind the reception counter, scolding her daughter for making up ridiculous prices. The embarrassed mother bowed deeply towards Simon, apologizing for her child's behavior and clarifying that the real lodging fee was only 5 gold a night, prompting Enoch to pout in the background about how the traveler almost fell for her scheme. Smiling calmly, the wind contractor placed 10 solid gold coins on the counter, stating that it was perfectly fine because he would have been forced to sleep out on the cold street if Enoch had not brought him in. The mother gasped in awe at the generous tip, bowing with overwhelming gratitude and offering to show him to his room, but Enoch instantly snatched the keys away, insisting that guiding the guest was her personal job. Pushing her mother toward the staircase, the cheerful girl told her mom to go inside and rest, to which the tired woman agreed before heading upstairs. Right at that moment, Edward strolled down the stairs, stretching his arms and yawning as he remarked that having an actual guest was a miracle since he thought the inn was about to go completely bankrupt. Grinning at the lobby, the mercenary asked if everyone slept well, complaining that the cheap bed made his entire body ache before suddenly catching sight of the traveler and gasping in utter shock. Pointing a finger at the young mage, Edward shouted Lanyon's name in disbelief, leaving our guy facepalming with a deep, exhausted sigh. The next morning over breakfast, A roaring fire warmed the inn dining hall as Enoch served hot cornbread and steaming bowls of onion soup to the table. Edward took one look at his meal and complained aloud, asking if serving the exact same menu for 2 straight weeks was not a bit excessive. Hearing his critique, Enoch panicked and called for her mom, prompting the mother to chase the tomboy around the counter with a broom while scolding her to go get some rest. Edward called after the girl, teasingly asking if she was pretending to be deaf, all while maintaining a firm, suffocating grip on Simon's arm. Trying to pull his arm away, the spirit contractor complained that holding onto him like a needy leech was extremely uncomfortable, but Edward just grinned devilishly, explaining he was holding tight so the wizard would not ghost him again. Suddenly a bright burst of green wind materialized as Spirit King Elkane appeared in his bird form, flapping his wings and asking what the 2 humans were doing. Edward waved casually at the majestic spirit, addressing him as Gramps, while Simon warmly asked his spirit companion if he rested well. Turning back to the table, Edward casually mentioned that Enoch tried to overcharge the young mage for lodging, to which our guy asked how he could possibly know that. Edward explained that the poor girl was desperately pushing herself to raise enough money to pay his mercenary commission fee, since the city lockdown meant 0 tourists were coming in. Simon paused, repeating the words commission fee in thought. Chewing on his cornbread, Edward revealed that the official request he took yesterday was directly from Enoch, whose father had mysteriously vanished without a trace. Glancing over at the young girl wringing a wet towel into a bucket with a determined face, Edward solemnly noted how much her heart must ache, admiring how she acted overly cheerful just to keep her mother from worrying. Leaning in close to the wizard, the veteran mercenary lowered his voice, revealing that his investigation traced several dark clues straight to the Urnia Order. Simon's eyes sharpened with intense focus, asking if this missing person case was low-key connected to High Priest Escort. Edward set his wooden bowl down, admitting he did not have all the details yet, but pointed out that it was always the same corrupt story where a high and mighty noble priest puts on a saintly fraud persona while executing horrific dirty work behind the scenes. Meanwhile, deep inside the grand cathedral of the Urnia Order, cultists knelt before the glowing statue of Urnia, chanting prayers to endure the ordeal through faith as High Priest Escort glided past rows of afflicted citizens. Walking past victims whose faces were already sprouting jagged blue crystals, the saintly priest put on a serene smile, reassuring the suffering believers that pain was merely a temporary process, promising that the moment they overcame fear and balance was restored, the agony would stop and they would finally become whole before calling on everyone to pray for the destined day. Back at the inn, Edward drained the last drop of soup from his bowl, sighing in satisfaction over a great meal. Our wind mage squinted at his full belly, calling him out for complaining about the menu being repetitive right before devouring Simon's soup as well. Edward patted his stomach with a loud burp, flexing that a mercenary has to eat heavy no matter what, while Elkane perched on the wooden table, trash-talking human food as utterly tasteless slop. Down at the front desk, the mother wiped down the counter, gently telling Enoch that she was feeling fine and instructing her to go upstairs to rest, but the tomboy stubborn as ever told her mom to stop worrying. Suddenly, a terrible chill washed over the room as the mother's eyes widened in sheer agonizing shock, clutching her chest with a choked gasp before collapsing violently against the counter. Enoch screamed in absolute horror, watching her mother fall unconscious onto the floorboards. Instantly snapping into action, Edward shouted Lannion's name as our guy leaped over the wooden table, with the mercenary frantically yelling for the wizard to cast any kind of healing magic right now. But as they knelt beside the fallen woman, a horrifying sound echoed through the room as jagged blue crystal spikes violently burst through the mother's skin, rapidly consuming her leg with terrifying speed. At that exact moment, deep beneath the cathedral floorboards, a hooded cultist descended a dark stone stairwell into the subterranean dungeons to deliver an urgent report to High Priest Escort. Standing in the shadows, the informant revealed that the outsider named Lannion was officially confirmed to be the legendary Wind Mage, who contracted with the Spirit King himself. Escort froze in his tracks, covering his face with both hands as tears of crazed religious ecstasy streamed down his cheeks. Murmuring the goddess's name in fanatical bliss, the priest threw his arms open toward the glowing holy magic in the ceiling, thanking Urnia from the bottom of his heart for sending a new light to illuminate his sacred calling. Looking out over a vast, terrifying subterranean cavern, the high priest gazed upon thousands of frozen blue crystal human statues standing like a silent army in the dark. Escort smiled with pure unhinged villain energy, declaring that Urnia gave him a calling to restore balance, gloating that with the Wind Mage in his grasp, He could achieve his ultimate goal even faster using this legion of crystal corpses to build a world where only mages exist. Kneeling beside the fallen innkeeper, our young mage channeled his spirit magic, casting the breeze spell to flush green healing wind over her leg to stop the crystal growth. But to his utter shock, the soothing green wind swirling around her skin failed to suppress the blue crystals, which continued to expand and crack across her leg. Simon stared at his hands in realization, wondering why his healing magic was not working at all, feeling an invisible force inside her body actively pushing his spirit mana out. Reaching out with a trembling hand, Iris gasped in a weak breath, begging the young wizard to keep her condition a complete secret. She weakly explained that anyone who began undergoing the ordeal was forced to enter the purification center inside the cathedral, crying softly as she realized that if she was taken away, Enoch would be left all alone with nobody to look after him. The wind contractor noted that he had heard of the purification center, assuming it was simply the church's medical treatment facility, and asked why she was so terrified of going there. Iris trembled in fear, exposing the dark truth that once someone entered the purification center, they were completely cut off from the world, and not a single person had ever returned alive. Edward leaned against the wooden wall, frowning as he pointed out that Enoch's missing father seemed to be mixed up with the church as well, calling the whole operation suspicious. Iris weakly sat up on the bed, bowing with heartfelt gratitude toward the young mage for easing her pain and introducing herself as Iris. The traveler introduced himself using his Lannian alias, while Spirit King Elkane fluttered onto his shoulder, staring intently at the woman and declaring that this human was extremely strange. Elkane explained that despite having 0 mana of her own, he could feel a massive, overwhelming light spirit presence lurking inside her body, revealing that Simon's healing magic failed because her physical body was already filled to the brim with another person's spirit mana. Simon looked at the pulsating golden light mixed within her blue crystals in shock, questioning if the ordeal was actually an artificial curse rather than a natural disease. Elkane hovered in the room, explaining with ancient wisdom that in a normal human body where the natural flow of mana had vanished, spirit energy could never dwell naturally. Before they could dig deeper, loud heavy knocking echoed from the lobby downstairs. Enoch cracked the bedroom door open with a terrified look, whispering that monks from the Urnia order had arrived looking for the wizard. Downstairs in the tavern, Edward stood at the entrance with his arms crossed, flexing his mercenary clout and trash-talking the hooded monks, telling them to get those creepy masks out of his face and get lost. The lead monk stated coldly that they had no business with the mercenary, telling him to step aside, but Edward threatened to break their wrists so they could never pray again. Ignoring the loose cannon entirely, the hooded monk looked past him toward the stairs, addressing Lannian directly and announcing that the high priest requested his presence for a private conversation. Edward stepped in front of the traveler, offering to handle the cultists himself, but our guy stepped past him with absolute chill, telling the monks to lead the way. Edward stood in stunned disbelief as the spirit contractor casually strolled out into the sunset streets with the church guards. Walking down the cobblestone road, the young wizard whispered to Elkane on his shoulder, noting that detection magic was being blocked near the cathedral, and asking the Spirit King to scout the church interior so they could prepare for any unexpected ambush. Elkane let out a dramatic sigh, complaining that a Grand Spirit King was being forced to do the scout work of a low-tier spirit before taking flight and soaring into the twilight sky. Entering the grand cathedral doors alone under the dark sky, our hero reflected on how the tragic events in Ratville and Gred Hill all traced back to the Urnia order, determined to uncover the truth himself. Stepping into the massive hall, the young wizard felt an exceptionally heavy, suffocating pressure in the air that was actively weakening his connection to Elkane. High Priest Escort stood at the far altar in pristine white robes, thanking the traveler for accepting his invitation and addressing him by his Lannian alias before calling him the Wind Mage. Walking forward with a saintly smirk, Escort noted that while spirit magic required a contract, each Spirit King bound themselves to only one mage in existence, expressing respect for meeting the legendary wizard in person. Simon stood tall, replying that the High Priest seemed to know an impressive amount about mages, declaring that he accepted the invitation because he had a direct question to ask. Looking Escort dead in the eye, the spirit contractor dropped the ultimate nuclear question point-blank, asking if the High Priest personally created the crystal ordeal in Gred Hill. Escort smirked without a flicker of fear, revealing a massive secret that while he served as the High Priest of Urnia, he was also a powerful mage who held a contract with a light spirit. Simon stared in shock as Escort walked around him, asking if the Wind Mage had ever stopped to think why mages were forced to live as a persecuted minority. Flashback visions of historical mages being burned at the stake by pitchfork-wielding mobs filled the air as Escort ranted that humans had feared and destroyed mages for centuries out of sheer ignorance, yet hypocritically begged mages for help whenever disasters struck. The high priest declared that a world where the inferior non-mages ruled over superior mages was an inverted broken order. Our hero countered his twisted villain logic, asking if that petty crusade was the reason innocent powerless citizens were being turned into frozen crystal statues and dying. Escort smiled serenely, claiming the victims were not dead at all, but were instead chosen for a noble calling, adding that non-mages should be profoundly grateful for serving a higher purpose. Raising his hands in fanatical zeal, Escort proclaimed that he intended to correct this broken world, declaring that in his new divine order there was zero room for anyone who was not a mage. Simon looked up at the looming statue of Urnia in horror, asking if this genocidal crusade was the official will of the entire Urnia order. Escort chuckled, admitting that for now, he was the only one in the church who understood this sacred calling, but boasted that mages across the Thuris kingdom were already rising up in secret. Extending his hand toward the young wizard with a wide manic smile, Escort invited the Wind Mage to join his side to build a world exclusively for mages. But our fearless fighter kept his head bowed low under his hood, his voice dropping to a deadly bone-chilling tone as he addressed the high priest. Reaching under his cloak, Simon dramatically whipped out the wanted bounty drawing of his mortal enemy Heiss, holding it up with glowing furious blue eyes, and demanding to know if that monster was also part of Escort's insane calling. Escort's saintly fraud smile froze instantly, his eyes narrowing in cold recognition as he admitted that while he and Klein shared the same route, their ultimate goals were slightly different. That single confirmation was all our hero needed to hear. In a blinding eruption of absolute fury, a colossal vortex of green wind mana violently exploded around the spirit contractor's body, his eyes glowing white with lethal bloodlust as he declared that their conversation was officially over, unleashing his full power to obliterate the high priest on the spot. Preparing to obliterate high priest Escort on the spot, our young mage reached out his hand to summon a deadly tempest, only for the swirling green wind mana to completely fizzle out and disperse into thin air. Simon stared at his open palm in sheer shock, realizing his mana was actively refusing to gather. Panic set in as he realized why he felt that heavy pressure earlier, suddenly noticing he could no longer sense Spirit King Elkin's presence at all. Realizing his spirit partner was forced to return to the spirit realm because the mana connection was completely severed. Escort stood at the altar with a smug, arrogant smirk, revealing that this private prayer room was the most sacred sanctuary in the cathedral, specifically designed with anti-mana barriers to block the flow of all magic so no individual could stand above the word of God. The wind contractor gritted his teeth, realizing he had walked straight into an anti-mana trap. Escort continued his creepy monologue, admitting that after hearing how the spirit contractor destroyed the underground operation in Ratville, he was obsessed with meeting the person behind such a violent greeting, gloating that meeting Simon made his heart pound so hard he could barely focus on church affairs. Reaching out with a saintly fraud persona, the high priest gently grabbed Simon's gloved hand, declaring that he had finally found the ultimate companion to fix this broken world and screaming that he needed Lanyon by his side. But our guy was not having any of his weird obsession, violently smacking Escort's hand away with absolute disgust as he demanded to know if the priest was completely insane and what his true connection was to Klein Heiss. Escort's smile instantly vanished, his face turning cold as he closed his eyes, stating that if the wizard needed things explained more clearly, he would happily oblige before addressing someone in the shadows to treat their guest with respect. On cue, the massive iron doors behind the spirit contractor creaked open, revealing a horde of masked candle-bearing cultist monks stepping out from the darkness to completely surround the powerless wizard in the anti-mana chamber. Meanwhile, out in the moonlit streets of Gredhill, Edward walked back toward the inn carrying a massive wooden crate loaded with fresh meat and fruit, wondering if the young wizard had a secret plan or if Edward should just return to his mercenary group for now. Up ahead, he noticed hooded monks wandering the town, preaching that the high priest was offering prayers while brainwashed townspeople bowed in gratitude for the church's circuit rounds. Heading inside the tavern, the loose cannon slammed the heavy crate of food directly onto the wooden dining table in front of Enoch and Iris. As the mother and daughter stared in shock, Edward explained that with Iris bedridden, going out for food was impossible, telling them to eat the fresh meat to get by. Iris bowed her head in deep gratitude, thanking Edward for going out of his way to help them, but the mercenary waved it off, grumbling that he was simply sick of eating boring bread and onion soup anyway. Edward then asked about the monks wandering the streets, questioning what this so-called circuit was really about. Enoch hugged her mother tightly, as Iris solemnly explained that it was called the Grace Circuit, revealing that the church sent masked monks to sweep the town for anyone afflicted by the crystal plague to drag them to the purification center. Suddenly footsteps echoed outside the front entrance. Enoch panicked, grabbing her mother's hand in terror as the heavy front doors swung wide open. 3 masked cultist monks loomed in the doorway, declaring that it was the season of the ordeal and announcing they had arrived to deliver the high priest's will. Edward crossed his arms, glaring at the intruders as the monks crowded around Iris and Enoch. The lead monk reached under his cloak with a sinister smirk, pulling out a jagged blue crystal detection artifact. Enoch sweated in absolute horror, realizing that if her mother was carrying the crystal plague, that relic device would instantly detect it and glow. The lead monk stepped uncomfortably close to Iris, asking why she was trembling so violently and mocking that she looked as if she was about to burn to ashes. Thrusting the glowing artifact directly toward her face, the fanatic priest preached that there was nothing to fear because the high priest would embrace her suffering. Watching the cultists corner a helpless family, Edward's eyes darkened with raw lethal rage as he declared that he could not stomach watching this garbage anymore. In a split second, the mercenary lunged forward, grabbing the monk's wrist and twisting his arm with bone-crushing force. The lead monk screamed in agony as Edward demanded to know what a grown man thought he was doing to a sick woman. The fanatic shrieked that Edward was committing profanity against Ernia, prompting a second monk to charge forward, screaming that he would stop the mercenary in the name of Ernia. But Edward countered instantly, declaring that he only believed in his own name as he unleashed a brutal strike that sent the attacking monk flying across the room in a splatter of blood. Panicking out of his mind, the lead monk screamed at his subordinate to check the mother immediately by order of the high priest. The subordinate monk grabbed Iris aggressively, causing her to scream as he shoved poor Enoch onto the wooden floor. The lead monk threatened that the high priest would never let Edward get away with this treason, but Edward erupted into a full berserker rage, trash-talking the fanatic bastards as he spun through the air and delivered a devastating downward smash. The lead monk slammed face-first into the wooden floorboards with a sickening crash, coughing up blood as he lay broken on the ground. Desperate to carry out his order, the bleeding monk pointed a trembling finger toward Iris, screaming that she was afflicted by the ordeal as the subordinate monk pulled back her skirt, exposing the glowing blue crystals pulsating on her leg for everyone to see. Opening his eyes in the pitch-black darkness, the young genius took in the terrifying nightmare hidden directly beneath the cathedral. His glowing blue eye snapped open to reveal a massive subterranean cavern where thousands of human figures were frozen inside glowing blue crystals, their faces locked in pure agonized terror. Staring in utter horror, the captive mage gaped at the horror show before asking in shock if these were the crystallized residents of Gred Hill. High Priest Escort looked back with a creepy serene smile, claiming that these people were not dead at all. The twisted priest asserted that they had simply been chosen for a noble calling. Looking out over the endless sea of frozen victims, the Wind Mage realized there were far too many to count. The horrific crystal statues stood packed together in agonizing poses, forcing Simon to think to himself that if they really were not dead, the truth was even worse. He strained against his bonds in frustration, causing the heavy iron chains to rattle loudly against the stone chair. Thick metal links wrapped tightly around his wrists, torso, and legs, binding him completely while Escort continued his delusional villain speech. The priest grandly announced that these victims were God's legion. He explained that to build a world exclusively for mages and filter out the non-magical filth, these frozen citizens would play a vital role. Sitting comfortably at a nearby dining table, the villain casually sliced into a fresh piece of meat on his plate. Taking a forkful, the cult leader stated that the victims were simply waiting for their time. Sweating profusely and glaring with pure rage, Simon spat out the high priest's name, demanding to know if the bastard planned to kill every single person in the region. Holding his fork over the dark meat, Escort calmly looked back at his bound guest before setting his fork down, claiming that kill was such an inaccurate word. The high priest declared that Gred Hill was where his grand calling truly began, promising that this city would soon become their holy land. Smirking serenely, the priest ate a bloody red piece of meat straight off his fork, prompting Simon to grit his teeth and angrily ask what happened to the innocent children of Ratville. Escort casually looked down at his plate and addressed the young wizard by his alias Lannion, asking if he had ever heard of the horrific rumor that anyone could become a mage by eating a young mage's heart. The plate revealed a cooked child's heart sliced open right beside a knife and fork. Escort chuckled darkly, calling it such an absurd myth, leaving the Wind Mage staring with wide, horrified eyes as total disgust washed over his face. Meanwhile, back at the local inn, the situation boiled over as the Ernia Order monks surrounded Iris on the floor, shouting that she had been afflicted by the ordeal. The lead monk ordered his men to take her to the Order immediately, but out of nowhere, Edward stepped in with an explosive punch that slammed directly into the cultist's face. The brutal blow landed with insane force, sending the monk flying across the room and crashing into the wall. Dust rolled off the mercenary's muscular arms, leaving the surviving cultist gasping in absolute horror. Edward lunged forward like an aggressive brawler, tackling the cultist before the guy could even react. The terrified monk tried to scramble away on his hands and knees, calling Edward a total lunatic. Reaching out, our guy grabbed the fleeing coward by his hood and delivered another bone-crushing right hook straight into his jaw. The punch smashed the priest into the floorboards, leaving him groaning in agony while Edward stood victorious over the pile of beaten cultists. Suddenly, the front doors slammed open as spear-wielding town guards rushed into the inn, yelling to demand what was going on and asking for the meaning of this absolute chaos. The guards quickly pointed their sharp spear tips right at Edward, shouting for him not to move. The brawny fighter stood his ground, completely unbothered by the drawn weapons while the bloodied monk groaned on the floor. Frantically pointing at Iris, the priest screamed at the guards to drag that girl away immediately, yelling that she was a profane sinner who had hidden the plague. Iris clutched herself in fear, trembling under the sudden accusation. Flexing his dark aura, Edward released a heavy sigh, commenting that this entire city was a complete mess. The tension hung heavy as the guards hesitated to strike, prompting an old memory to flash in the mercenary's head where his guild boss warned him not to go causing trouble. Edward realized with an annoyed look that Roy was going to murder him for throwing hands. Cracking his knuckles with a confident smirk, the fighter admitted to himself that it was already too late now. He popped his fingers, complaining that he always ended up drawing the short straw before dropping into a low combat stance. The fearless brawler grinned wildly, declaring out loud that he was getting bored anyway, so this worked out perfectly, telling the guards to bring it on. Seeing the monster get ready for battle, the bloodied monk on the floor screamed at the guards to take that man as well, commanding them to escort the brute under heavy guard directly to the order headquarters. The injured cultist barked out his orders through a mouth full of blood, prompting a confused guard to ask why they were not taking him to the city prison. The monk screamed back that the brute had beaten down 4 of their men, gritting his teeth as he added that for insulting Ernia, the order would personally make him pay. Edward paused as those specific words registered in his mind, repeating the phrase order headquarters in his head as a big-brain realization struck him. His eyes widened as he realized that if that was the case, things were working out even better than planned. He smirked as he realized the cultists were basically offering him a free VIP pass to walk right into their main base without breaking a sweat. Looking back at Iris and Enoch, the fighter grinned, thinking that this was not bad at all. Raising both hands high in the air, Edward casually announced that it was fine, leaving the guards blinking in utter shock at his sudden submission. The mercenary threw his hands up high, loudly declaring that he surrendered. The guards quickly bound the fighter's arms with thick rope while also tying up Iris, marching them both toward the exit. Iris looked back nervously toward her young daughter who was left behind in the tavern, softly calling out Enoch's name as tears welled up in her eyes. Poor little Enoch completely broke down, crying out for her mother as tears streamed down her red cheeks. Hearing the young girl cry, Edward turned back with his bound arms, telling her nicely that there was no need to look so sad. Flashing a wide, confident grin and giving her a tied-up thumbs up, he promised her that he would finish the job and bring both her mother and father back home safely. Wiping her eyes, the brave girl sniffled and gave him a nod, agreeing with a soft okay. Enoch rubbed her nose and wiped away her remaining tears as the guards shouted for everyone to move out, ushering the bound captives into the dark night street and leaving little Enoch standing all alone in the quiet inn. Back inside the cathedral's underground sanctum, High Priest Escort continued talking from his dining table, repeating the absurd rumor that eating a young mage's heart could turn anyone into a wizard. The twisted priest shook his head, lamenting how foolish that belief was before turning his glowing yellow eyes back to Simon, asking if he knew how many innocent children had died in agony because of that lie. A horrific flashback panel revealed an entire village consumed by roaring flames and chaotic destruction, where masked kidnappers brutally grabbed helpless children amidst the inferno. Escort's voice echoed through the memory, claiming that when he thought of the children sacrificed back then, his heart still broke. Standing before the burning hellscape of his past, the priest claimed that the rumor was not entirely baseless after all. Turning back to the Wind Mage, Escort explained that if a mage consumed a child's heart, their mana would be temporarily amplified, adding that this boost applied even if that child was not a mage. Straining against his heavy iron bindings, Simon glared with absolute disgust and fury. Escort sliced another piece of the heart on his plate, asserting that ultimately this was a privilege only mages could enjoy, claiming that the envy of inferior non-mages must have distorted the truth into a false myth. Gesturing toward the subterranean ocean of crystallized corpses, Escort declared that God's will was vast, adding that a vast will inevitably demanded a heavy price. Walking slowly toward the bound wizard, The high priest claimed that in that sense, the destruction of Ratville was simply necessary collateral damage, calling the tragic village the cornerstone of their new holy land in Gred Hill. Suddenly, an overwhelming surge of golden divine mana erupted around Escort, illuminating the dark room like a blinding sun. Spreading his arms wide in the holy light, the villain asked if the young genius understood his meaning now, claiming that Urnia had surely led Simon to this place for a divine reason. Flaunting his insane flex, the high priest announced that he would ask the young wizard once more. Looking down with a sinister fanatical smirk, Escort asked if our hero would join him in fulfilling their calling to build a brave new world where only mages existed. After Escort delivered his insane pitch to build a world where only mages exist, the story shifted back to the town, in where little Enoch sat on her bed, holding a framed photograph of her family. She remembered her father happily hugging her in sweeter times, causing the young girl to softly whisper for her father. Looking closely at the picture frame, she held the precious memory tight, recalling her father patting her head while holding a wooden box and calling out her name. The young girl remembered his kind face clearly, hearing his voice echo in her memory as he told her to take this out whenever she needed to protect someone truly precious. Sitting up on her bed, Enoch realized that, come to think of it, the time was right now. She slid open her nightstand drawer and unlatched the wooden container hidden inside. Resting on the felt lining was a glowing blue crystal pendant relic. Clutching the glowing blue stone in her hand, the brave girl murmured about how it worked, her eyes narrowing with fierce determination as she declared that she could not just sit here and wait. Meanwhile, deep below the grand exterior of the Urnia Order Cathedral, Simon's face went dark in shadowed anger as he gritted his teeth over how the innocent children of Ratville had to die for such a sickening reason. The captive mage erupted into a furious scream, forcing his inner mana to explode outward. He strained against his metal-cuffed wrist, forcing power directly through the suppression seals until a glowing wind spell symbol flared brightly right on his restriction cuff. A massive blast of green wind magic exploded around him, making Escort turn around to watch the show. Simon's eyes glowed wildly as wind mana burst violently from his chest, swirling around his body in an intense cyclone. Screaming through the agony, the wind mage tried to break through the anti-mana device, causing a heavy shockwave to echo as his spell power was forcibly compressed. Escort looked back calmly, asking if this was his answer as green wind energy gathered and materialized into a tight glowing orb right beside Simon. Escort watched with an intrigued glint in his eye, as he explained that the suppression device blocked magic, while simultaneously materializing his mana into a physical sphere. A dark silhouette of Simon showed his chest burning in intense agony as Escort added that the more he tried to use magic, the more pain he would feel. The materialized green mana orb hovered in the air until the depleted and trembling wizard slumped back into the stone chair, panting heavily in sheer pain. Escort stared at the floating orb in surprise, before reaching out to catch the materialized green mana sphere right in his palm. Escort looked at the sphere in sheer awe, remarking that even though it was only for a moment, for the materialized mana density to be this high was unbelievable. The cult leader gasped that he could not fathom the depth of the young wizard's latent mana. Sweating profusely and gasping for breath, Simon looked up in complete confusion as Escort stared at the glowing green orb with a creepy, greedy look in his eye. The high priest raised the condensed mana sphere directly over his open mouth, opened wide, and swallowed the materialized mana orb whole. Throwing his head back, Escort absorbed the raw power into his body, sending a surge of magic reverberating through the dark cavern as his eye flashed with a blinding green light. Blue crystals sparkled quietly around the subterranean room as Escort stood over the bound mage, while raw power rolled off his frame. The high priest exclaimed that, as expected of the Spirit King's contractor, the guy was incredible, while Simon panted heavily for breath. Escort admitted that, as a fellow mage, he was almost jealous. Looking down at the plate containing the child's heart, the villain noted that, to be honest, it was no easy feat for a single person to create an entire army, stating that it required an immense amount of mana. Divine golden flames flared off Escort's hand as he claimed that yet, this power was truly marvelous. Blazing in holy light, the cult leader raised his hand, declaring that there was no more time to waste. Escort added that he had hoped the young wizard would join them, but before the will of God, he had no choice. Simon gritted his teeth in sheer panic, thinking about how first it was the prayer room and now this insane mana control. The wind mage realized he had never seen or heard of anything like it in his life. Watching Escort stand in the dark hall, Simon realized this was not something one person could make, recalling Escort mentioning other mages like him and wondering if those mages created this system. Simon wondered if Heiss was the mastermind behind all of them. Sweating heavily, our boy gritted his teeth, realizing damn it, there was no time to think as wind mana violently erupted around his body once again. Green energy strands whipped around his torso, shocking his frame with intense pain, but gritting his teeth against the shock, Simon declared to himself that first he had to act. Escort laughed in manic glee, shouting "Oh my god" at the insane show of will as wind currents exploded across the massive underground cavern. Screaming in pure agony with blood trickling from his mouth and eyes, Simon shouted in his mind that he was getting out of here, generating a force so massive that shockwaves rattled the cathedral's stone foundation. Down in the cathedral prison dungeon, dust rained down from the stone ceiling on Edward, who was chained inside his cell. The mercenary commented that it felt like an earthquake, asking aloud if they shouldn't run. Looking at the iron bars, the brawler wondered why the Order even needed a prison with facilities like this. Tied to an X-frame on the cell wall, Edward sarcastically asked if they performed torture in this place, whispering across the bars to call out hey to a hooded guard sitting nearby. The guard ignored him completely, leaving Edward to think to himself that he managed to get inside, but now he had to figure out how to find the purification center. Edward kicked his leg against the stone wall with a loud thud to test the prison's structural integrity, stroking his chin as he thought that there had to be a way further down. Suddenly his eyes snapped wide in shock as he gasped out a surprised sound when a small figure crept quietly down the dark wooden stairs into the cell block. Recognizing the kid, Edward thought in complete disbelief, asking how on earth Enoch got in here. Enoch quickly pressed a finger to her lips, signaling Edward to shush with cute cartoon cat icons floating around her. Sweating in exasperation, Edward sighed to himself that there was no choice then. The mercenary suddenly leaned against his chains, puffing his cheeks and screaming at the top of his lungs that he thought he was going to throw up, feigning a massive gag to draw attention. The two hooded guards at the desk turned around in annoyance, one asking what was wrong with him all of a sudden while Enoch quietly sneaked behind them. While the guards were distracted by Edward's loud fake puking shouts, Enoch slipped low under the desk and crouched out of sight. The young girl looked up at a ring of heavy prison keys hanging on a hook above the desk, reaching her small hand up with trembling nerves as her fingers stretched toward the metal. Her fingertips reached the keyring and Enoch grabbed the heavy keys tightly, smiling in relief as the brave girl whispered in triumph that it worked. But suddenly, Edward's eyes went wide with sheer terror as he screamed Enoch's name at the top of his lungs. Out of nowhere, a dark hooded guard appeared directly behind her, grabbing the helpless girl by her shoulder as Enoch froze in horror, trapped right in front of the cell keys. As the guard grabbed little Enoch by the shoulder in the cathedral prison, the scene returned to the subterranean chamber where Simon sat bound and exhausted, panting heavily with blood dripping from his chin. A glowing green mana orb hovered in the air beside Escort, who watched the sphere remarking that such persistence was truly a pity. The priest added that surely Simon knew that mana depletion meant death, reaching his hand toward the green orb and praising the energy, calling it truly magnificent. Throwing his head back, Escort swallowed the green mana orb whole while Simon panted in the background, causing golden fire mana to blaze wildly around the cult leader's frame. Engulfed in divine flames before the bound wizard, Escort looked back over his shoulder with golden eyes, warning Lanyon that once he died it was over. The villain advised that as long as he was alive, his potential was limitless, telling him to think about it carefully. Simon gritted his teeth, panting heavily in exhaustion while Escort walked toward the exit doors, announcing that he would return as soon as the worship service was over. The vast subterranean cavern remained quiet, filled with glowing blue crystals as blood dripped slowly onto the cold stone floor. Sitting alone in the stone throne, with blood dripping from his chin, green wind mana began to swirl around the young wizard once again. Simon analyzed his desperate situation, realizing it was the same result no matter how many times he tried. Looking at his suppression cuff, he noted that the moment his mana left his body, it got absorbed by the seal, realizing that the stronger the magic he used, the more he was just feeding the device. Sweating and dripping blood, our protagonist panicked, asking himself what he should do. Simon resolved to try one more time, closing his eyes to concentrate his energy and deciding in the dark silence of his mind to try talking to his spirit. Suddenly a traumatic flashback surfaced in his memory, showing young child Simon asking brightly if really. Uncle Rousset smiled warmly, confirming yes and assuring the boy that once his father found out he could use spirit magic, his father would be pleased. But the memory turned horrific as roaring flames engulfed a building in the past, revealing Rousset's severed head hanging by its hair and dripping dark blood amidst the fire. The dark silhouette of Heiss stood before the burning house holding a bloody sword and the head. Young Simon stood beside little Diana, crying out to ask why his father would do this, while Diana trembled and whispered "Father." Heiss looked down with cold, glowing white eyes, stating that it was a royal decree before commanding Simon to make himself useful for once. Enraged, young Diana screamed for the monster to die as she charged forward, while someone shouted in panic for Diana to stop. A brutal slash of light split Diana in half right in front of Heiss, leaving young Simon staring in wide-eyed terror as tears spilled down his face. An adult figure in the flames urged young Simon to run, screaming frantically for him to hurry and run as a slash of blood cut across the vision, followed by Klein's silhouette whispering ominously for Simon to give him his heart. Heiss' cold, menacing face glared through the flaming memory until Simon snapped his eyes open in the present, gritting his teeth in surprise and rage. Sitting alone in the massive cavern, our fellow took a heavy breath and gritted his teeth, thinking with fierce resolve that he could not let it end here. Pulling on his metal cuffs, he declared to himself that there had to be a way as green wind mana swirled into a ball beside him. Simon stared intently at the materialized green orb, his blue eye analyzing the floating magic sphere as his mind raced, until a high IQ strategy hit him. Meanwhile, back in the cathedral prison, the guard held little Enoch in the air by her collar while she struggled, yelling for him to let her go. Another guard watched nearby as the brute held the kid, growling as he asked how this brat even got in here while Enoch grunted in pain. Edward gripped the cell bars in rage, screaming at the guards to let the kid go and asking if that was what Ernia taught them. Enoch remembered her father's words telling her to use this when she needed to protect someone precious, and her face tightened with determination. Raising the blue crystal pendant high into the air, she screamed out for Uncle Edward, leaving the guards looking surprised. A beat of silence passed as Enoch held the crystal up, while Edward and the guards watched in confusion. Enoch struggled in the guard's grip, screaming Edward Boker's full name in desperation before whimpering out Ed's name as her grip slipped. The blue crystal pendant dropped from her fingers onto the stone floor with a loud clatter, and hitting the floorboards, the crystal flared with a blinding light before a massive explosive shockwave of blue spirit energy detonated across the prison room. Upstairs in the cathedral's grand sanctuary, High Priest Escort preached to the mass congregation, stating that pain was merely a process while hundreds of brainwashed followers in robes prayed silently alongside plague-afflicted citizens before the altar. Engulfed in a divine golden aura, Escort preached that the moment they overcame fear and found balance, things would change, promising that here at the Purification Center, the pain would stop and they would finally become whole. Escort raised his arms wide to the sky in religious ecstasy, just as a follower in the front row prayed with hands clasped, only for blue crystal chunks to suddenly erupt right out of his knuckle. The worshipper looked at his hands in confusion, asking huh, before jagged blue crystals violently burst all over the man's face and arms as he gasped in panic. The guy screamed in pure agony as massive blue crystal spires erupted from the sanctuary floor, impaling and encasing worshippers en masse while mass panic erupted across the hall. High Priest Escort spread his hands smoothly, praising Ernia with a serene smile as horrified followers screamed at him in betrayal, calling for the High Priest as they died. Worshippers writhed in agony as crystal spikes burst through their throats and chests, rapidly transforming into solid blue crystal statues amidst the horrific genocide. Escort fell back into a serene prayer posture with a peaceful smile, completely unbothered by the massacre as a strange wooden geometric relic in the room flared with light, while he prayed for Ernia to lead him to his calling. Down below in the subterranean room, blue crystals hummed around the cavern as Simon's chains rattled on the throne. Green wind strands whipped furiously around his chair as Simon gritted his teeth, analyzing the suppression device in his mind, and noting that it absorbed the mana released to cast magic and materialized that energy into a physical sphere. An internal diagram appeared in his mind showing a reverse flow circuit as Simon realized that if he used that mechanism to force his mana into a reverse flow, the tension should overload the device. Simon's eyes flared with desperate resolve, knowing he was dead if he just stayed like this anyway. Gritting his teeth through the pain, he realized he didn't know if it would destroy the device, but he had to try, focusing every ounce of concentration to control it precisely so the overload happened inside the device itself, realizing that otherwise his own body would explode. Green wind magic erupted in a massive roaring vortex around Simon as he initiated the high-stakes reverse flow overload attempt. As green wind magic erupted around Simon in a high-stakes gamble to overload the suppression device, High Priest Escort walked back down into the subterranean cavern, surrounded by thousands of crystallized victims. Stacked bodies filled the subterranean cavern as Escort walked past the statues, stating that Ernia answered those who waited. He added that now he had no reason to wait any longer, reaching his hand out as he noted that before he heard Lanian's answer, he should get things started. Escort touched one of the frozen crystal corpses with a serene smile, igniting divine golden energy around the victim's body, until the crystallized human's eyes snapped open with glowing yellow light. Standing before the reanimated thrall, Escort stated that the man had been reborn as part of God's legion, commanding the thrall to fulfill the will of Urnia as the crystal monster erupted with a demonic screech. Meanwhile, up in the cathedral corridor, Iris walked barefoot down the dark hallway, gasping for air and clutching her chest as blue crystal growth sprouted further across her skin. Looking around the empty hall in confusion, Iris wondered aloud where she needed to go. Down below, Simon's reverse flow magic explosion caused stone to crack beneath his throne, forcing the wind mage to let out an agonized growl as the suppression cuff on his wrist cracked from extreme tension. A green wind mana sphere detonated right beside his seat, spewing blood from Simon's mouth as the stone chair crumbled into pieces. Gasping with blood on his chin, the young wizard realized he knew it, analyzing that if the reverse flow was too strong, it created internal tension in his body that his frame could not take. But if it was too weak, his mana would just get absorbed again, making him realize he had to apply the exact amount of tension to the device. Cracks spread across his metal restriction cuffs as a sharp cracking sound echoed through the chamber. Simon's blue eye snapped wide in realization as he thought that it was working, urging himself to push for just a little more. Heavy cracks fractured the metal cuffs, and screaming in his mind for just a little more, Simon pushed his mana to the absolute limit until a massive green wind cyclone exploded upward, shattering the stone throne into complete rubble. Out in Gred Hill town, night descended as blood-curdling screams filled the streets while blood splattered across the pavement as reanimated crystal monsters attacked innocent villagers. A townsperson screamed in horror, asking what that was as crystal beasts rampaged through the area while citizens fled in total panic, screaming for help. A father screamed for someone to take the kids and run before getting brutally mauled by a monster. Down in the cathedral prison, a kneeling hooded guard prayed for those facing the ordeal to be reborn within the order. A massive shadowy crystal demon rose directly behind the guard. The guard looked up believing the high priest would protect him, only for blood to splatter violently across the floor as the crystal demon brutally slaughtered him on the spot. Back in the subterranean hallway, Iris stumbled forward weakly as a screeching crystal monster charged directly at her, causing her to trip and fall to the stone floor in terror. Blue crystals spread further up her leg as the monster lunged down to execute her with sharp claws. But closing her eyes in tears, Iris cried out Enoch's name right as blood violently splattered across the wall when the monster was obliterated in an instant. Down the hall, someone stood victorious over the shredded monster as Enoch gasped in shock, calling out Mom before running forward at top speed. Edward stood right beside Enoch in the hallway, yelling for her to wait while sweating heavily at the sight of the destroyed crystal beast, wondering what that thing even was as another crystal beast growled in the shadows. Back in the subterranean room, shattered chains lay amidst broken rubble as the stone throne sat completely obliterated, leaving Simon collapsed face up on the cracked floor, panting heavily. A familiar sarcastic voice echoed in his mind, calling him a reckless fool for diving into a dead end again. And opening his eyes, Simon saw the light blue hawk spirit landing right on his head. The hawk spirit asked if he was awake, making Simon gasp in shock as he recognized Spirit King Elkane. Pushing himself up, our guy asked if Elkane was okay, but Elkane scoffed, asking if he was seriously worrying about a Spirit King and telling him to worry about himself. The spirit noted that he had a feeling when their connection was cut, but looking at Simon, escort definitely got him. Looking down grimly, the young wizard admitted yes, stating that there was something he didn't expect, gritting his teeth as he added that either way they had to stop escort, noting that they needed to get out of here first. Elkane pointed out that Simon couldn't even stand on his own, but the hawk's eyes suddenly narrowed as he sensed a shift in the ambient magic, murmuring that this feeling meant something had begun. Simon looked up in shock, asking what, and Elkane explained that the mana on the surface was moving all at once. Realizing the horror, Simon noted that escort planned to wipe out everyone in Gred Hill and that the ordeal was all his doing, thinking to himself that if something had already begun, they were out of time. Heavy footsteps echoed from the cavern doorway as golden light illuminated the hall, making Simon and Elkane turn toward the entrance in total shock as High Priest Escort stepped through the shadows, announcing that today was a historic day. The villain walked into the room with an arrogant smile, remarking that it was an honor to meet the Spirit King on a day like this. Pushing himself up, Simon gritted his teeth and yelled Escort's name while Elkane looked at the glowing entrance, murmuring that so this was what was moving the mana on the surface. The hawk spirit added that the awful stench must be coming from them as well, warning Lannion grimly that this was bad as an entire army of thousands of reanimated crystal monsters emerged from the dark cavern, screeching in pure bloodlust.